Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and I'm so honored to be here with you all today and host this panel on wage gap and economic justice for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, AANHPI women. Thank you for joining us for this vital conversation, one that speaks the lived realities, resilience, and power of AANHPI women across the country. Earlier this month, we observed AANHPI Women's Equal Pay Day, a stark reminder that on average, AANHPI women make 83 cents to every dollar made by a non-Hispanic white man. And while the statistic is concerning in itself, it often masks deeper disparities among ethnic subgroups, immigrant women, and those working in low-wage industries. For example, while the wage gap overall for AANHPI women is 83 cents, the wage gap for Bhutanese American women is 45 cents for every dollar that a white man makes. And for Burmese women, it's 54 cents to every dollar a white man makes. So the gap is even greater. As AANHPI women, we are essential to the fabric of our communities as caregivers, workers, organizers, leaders. Yet too often, our experiences are not known to decision makers or advocates who work on gender wage gap. Sometimes this is due to not being there not being a whole lot of information about our community and the workforce, but other times and oftentimes it's because of stereotyping of our communities as model minorities. When I discuss economic inequality issues that impact our communities, I met with genuine confusion and sometimes even the question of, but I thought your community were all very well educated and all have good paying jobs. Whether it's wage inequity, access to paid leave, barriers faced by immigrant women, or the caregiving crisis, we are impacted in unique and significant ways. More than 1 in 4 Asian American, about 27%, live in multi-generational household compared to 19% of the US household overall. Some ethnicities are even more likely to live in multi-generational household. For example, Bhutanese Americans, 56%, Laotian Americans, 40%, and Cambodian Americans, 42%, and Hmong Americans at 36% live in multi-generational households. And those challenges are not just individual, they're systemic. These issues are more urgent than ever, given the potential cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, and programs that support millions of parents and families. Today, we gather not just to name these inequalities, but to imagine what justice looks like when AANHPI women are fully seen, heard, and valued. So before I introduce our first special guest today, one housekeeping item. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And for those of you joining us on YouTube, please drop your questions into the comments as well. Okay, now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you someone that I have respected for so long and feel so privileged to be in community with, and who has been a longtime champion of our communities in the halls of Congress. Congresswoman Grace Meng is a trailblazing member of Congress, proudly representing New York's 6th District in Queens. As the first and only Asian American member of Congress from New York State, she has been a powerful advocate for communities of color, families, small businesses, and women. A senior member of the House Appropriation Committee and the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, Congresswoman Meng has championed legislation to combat anti-Asian hate, close gender pay gaps, and expand access to resources for immigrant and working class families. I have personally had the privilege of seeing Congresswoman's work up front during COVID and during the rise of anti-API hate, and I cannot express enough my gratitude for your leadership, Congresswoman, for not just your constituents in New York, but for all of us all of us Asian Americans living across the country. So her work continues to shape national conversations on race, racial equity, justice, gender equity, and economic empowerment. So we are so happy to welcome you, Congresswoman.
Thank you so much for having me. Always love being with all of you.
Thank you. We're all living in what many would call very chaotic times. The national policy landscape has shifted dramatically, especially on economics for immigrant families. We're also seeing an uptick in anti immigration legislation that further seeks to criminalize and disenfranchise our community. I'm wondering how you and CAPAC are adopting to these shifts.
Sure, this is an important question, and I wish I had the perfect answer for you. There's no real way to sugarcoat it. The administration has put forth a lot of reckless policies that are, threatening the livelihood of our immigrant, working families, and small business owners. The tariffs, for example, will deliver, as we've heard directly from small business owners, devastating blows to our local consumers, to owners of these mom and pop establishments who may be forced to pass higher costs onto establishments, onto their customers, or suffer financial hits to their livelihoods. We've literally had some who will say, okay, we barely made it through the pandemic and we survived, but we may not make it this time. These businesses will be disproportionately affected because many of them import products, whether it's agricultural goods, cultural products, traditional medicines, that are specifically sourced from specific regions across the world. And the administration's attempts to deport legal residents, permanent residents, and immigrants with legal status without due process is also putting a target on the backs of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, the majority of whom are foreign born. CAPAC is trying to fight back against these attacks with the tools that we have, and they're coming frequently, right? We have led amicus briefs on some of the immigration cases pending in district courts, but we need to continue to amplify stories from our own communities so that we can show how dangerous some of these policies are for our community. Last week, for example, we did a press conference working with small businesses in Manhattan, Chinatown, to highlight the economic impacts of Trump's trade war on AANHPIs. And we know that this is a really scary time, whether you're an individual, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're an immigrant, whether you are a small business owner, and more. Sadly, the federal worker, right? The list just goes on and on. But I do want to end with a moment of hope, is that we as CAPAC are also finding ways in adapting, finding ways to work with other parts of our caucus, other communities. We're finding ways to partner with, for example, the Congressional Black Caucus, the Hispanic Caucus. Just there's strength in numbers. And so we think that this brings new opportunities for us to strengthen the tools that we have to protect our communities.
Thank you for that. I love that you ended on a note of hope. We really definitely need that. And I think you're right that many of us are leaning on each other more than ever, and that we're banding together, that, really believing in this idea of we're stronger together than apart. So thank you for that reminder. And yeah, I think many of us are feeling the weight of how much has shifted economically, socially, politically, especially the past few years. As we navigate this time of profound change, as you said, since COVID, people came out, survived COVID, and here we are. I mean, I'm hearing those stories all the time about, like, we thought surviving COVID was it, and now here we are, like, we don't know if we'll survive what's going on. So yeah, it's evident that the landscape for AA and HPI women have shifted so dramatically, and the challenges we face are not just about economic instability, but they're so deeply intertwined with, systemic issues that impact us, including immigration. One area where this is particularly evident is the realm of employment protections and immigration policies. Many AA and HPI women, especially those who are immigrant, find themselves in precarious work situations. They often occupy essential roles such as caregivers, hospitality, and service work that are undervalued and underprotected. Immigration policies have compounded these challenges. Many immigrant women are caught in the cycle of uncertainty, whether their legal status affects their ability to access fair wages, job security, and even basic workplace rights. Our immigration policies have created a labor force that is intentionally vulnerable, excluded from labor protections, and silenced by fear. And so we know immigrant enforcement policies have made many AAPI women, especially vulnerable at work. And just wondering, how have you seen these policies affect real families in your community?
Yeah, it definitely has an effect. We're hearing increased reports of ICE conducting more immigration raids at work sites, hospitals, schools, even, and just instilling a lot of fear amongst workers and communities and even employers about unjust targeting without due process. People are afraid to work. They're afraid to send their kids to school. We're forcing people to go further into the shadows. And then this coupled with, threats of cutting Medicaid and money to food pantries, it's just going to put people more in general in a more precarious situation. States are legislating and enacting statutes and regulations that preserve the key employment protections that the administration federally is trying to roll back. States like California, New York, Colorado, and Washington have expanded overtime pay protections. California, Oregon, and Maryland have enacted their own, for example, heat protection standards, which include ensuring adequate shade and water and rest breaks, and requiring employers to have a heat plan for both indoor and outdoor workers. And that's just an example of how some states are combating some of these issues. But as elected officials, we need to make sure that that guidance is available to employees and employers on what protections are afforded to immigrant employees. People, there's still a lot of misinformation or not enough information out there. CAPAC put out a Know Your Rights resource in multiple AANHPI languages so that our members could help their constituents to better understand and have access to critical information in their language. Employment protections like protection from discrimination and guaranteed family and medical leave are really essential to the well-being of AANHPI women and gender expansive people, and are directly linked to pay inequity. Without guaranteed family and medical leave, AANHPI women who might want to start a family or need essential medical care will literally be forced to choose between their health and their families and their careers. And, without these protections, they are essentially shut out of higher paying jobs that could help us to close that wage gap. The other major barrier here is disaggregating the data. We need to see the larger picture and the impacts on each individual group within our larger diaspora to be able to fully and accurately address the wage inequities. We need to know the whole picture. But that's why I'm really grateful to you and your team for always providing resources like the fact sheet, the equal pay fact sheet, which really drills down into the data to show inequities by specific ethnic groups. We need the data to be able to really fix the problem.
Hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for that. And that reminds me of something my predecessor, actually, Miriam Young, used to say about API women and girls, right? We're like unicorns. People have heard about us, but not seen us when it comes to data, right? And so that's really, really important. And so, as you know, we are doing our best in terms of collecting the data, disaggregating the data. But as you said, the lack of data is a huge problem, and the overly aggregated data is a huge problem. And so just wondering, what are some ways that you think that we can still make a compelling case for action with when our communities are so undercounted and visible in numbers?
Yeah, being invisible, that is really a thing. And without data, or before we can get the full and accurate data, it's really important to share the testimonies and to share the stories so that people don't think and don't view us as invisible.
Mhm.
Data on women and girls is aggregated, which hides the disparities within our own community along ethnic, gender, income lines, immigration status. For example, AANHPI women are overrepresented in low wage occupations or the caregiving economy, which is often not even included in official economic data. We are also the most likely group to care for elderly parents in the US. 73% of AANHPIs believe that they are expected to care for their parents. And this puts our communities in the unique position of both formal and informal caregiving. We hear a lot about the sandwich generation or middle aged adults that they're literally caring for both their aging family members and their minor children. And for many people in our communities, this is a role that feels culturally expected of us, right?
Mhm.
And it's not always represented in data, of course, but we also represent a significant portion of the formal caregiving economy through paid direct support professionals, nurses, nurse aides, home care workers. And oftentimes these roles are lower wage and paid by the hour. Official economic data does not reflect this caregiving disparity among others in our communities. And that's why it is important to continue working towards disaggregating that data so we can accurately address the wage gap disparities.
Thank you for that. That is so important, right? That, as we talk about gender wage gap for the API community, we always talk about there's more to the story, right? More to the 83 cents that we make, in relation to a white man who makes a dollar. And that when you unpack that, there's so much more. So even if I'm making 83 cents a white man's dollar, I am spending my resources and my time with all these additional care duties, as you've talked about. That's not necessarily supported. We are the infrastructure, right, for our families, and so that's such a great reminder. So as you were talking, I was also reminded of, the National Women's Law Center did put out a report. I think it was like a year and a half after COVID about women in the workforce, and they did like a study by racial group, and they said that Asian American women had the highest percentage of long-term unemployment. And that was like shocking to everyone, right? Like it was like a pretty significant data point. I know it is when I get calls from reporters, right? They're like, "Oh, I saw this data point. Do you have anything to say?" And I remember doing an interview with a Korean, it's a Korean newspaper that circulates in the US. And he was like, "Well, aren't Asian women all working from home, or?" And I was like, "No, like think about it. Who serves you food when you go eat at a restaurant? Like who's bagging your groceries? Who's the cashier at your supermarket, at your Korean grocery store, right?" And like even this reporter, like it took a minute for him to realize, "Oh my gosh, like the service workers I interact with are all from my community." And there's this disconnect in our brains about ideas of the kind of work API women do versus the reality of immigrant, especially immigrant generation, API women in these sectors. And so I actually still have the copy of the article because he wrote it in such a it was such a awakening moment for him to realize, like, wow, so many of our community members do work in these essential, essential, what we were calling essential workers, or got laid off because they were working in office, in restaurants, or like beauty service industries where they got shut down. So I think it's really important for us to remember, right, that when we advocate for our community, for the broader AANHPI community, that it is really about our ability to provide for our families in a meaningful way. And as an immigrant working mom, I remember when I had my first kid, this feeling of, and I didn't know there was this thing, but like, you're expected to work like you don't parent, and you're expected to parent like you don't work. And I think that's just such an absurd reality that we live with. And I think it's exasperated for our communities who have limited language access and limited career opportunities due to language access or their educational credentials not being able to transfer. And so this is why it's even more important that when we talk about wage gap and gender wage gap, it's not just the cents per dollar, it's about the whole ecosystem of care. And so in closing our conversation, we want to thank you so much, Congresswoman Meng, for being such a champion and for your continued leadership. I just want to, as we close this part of our conversation, lift up that, we that again, it's not just about the money percent, but it's really about creating a world where, those of us who are parents, who are moms, can parent the children we have with dignity and agency. And how are we creating a world where we can all, no matter what work you are doing, that you are valued as a worker. And so we're really grateful to be in community with leaders like you, Representative Meng, and for all of you here today. And we look forward to continuing this fight together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. And a thank you again to Yeon and Congressman Meng for that really insightful discussion. My name is Sidel Bretto. I'm the policy manager here at NAPAWF. We'll now be transitioning into the second part of today's program, which will dive a little deeper into the lived experiences of AANHPI women and the realities of the barriers to economic justice they face. So joining me for this next part of today's program is Estella Owima Church. Stella has dedicated her career to working in nonprofits, education, performing arts, and organizing. For more than 20 years, she has rooted her service in the values of solidarity and collective liberation. Estella is a speaker, educator, and consultant, bringing creative strategies to create transformative spaces and to build a just future. Welcome, Estella. I'm also happy. Oh, hi. I'm also happy to welcome Monica Kant to today's conversation. She is the CEO of the Asian Pacific Institute of Gender-Based Violence. Monica is an immigration attorney who has worked in the legal nonprofit space for 25 years, representing survivors of gender-based violence and asylum-seeking immigrants. Thank you so much for being here today, Monica.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be with you all today.
So my first question is for you, Monica. You bring a unique lens to analyzing the issues, that we've been discussing over the past half hour. How does the intersection of economic insecurity and gender-based violence uniquely impact AANHPI women? And what policy changes or community investments do you believe are most urgent to address both of these issues?
Thank you so much for that question. And as you know, Congresswoman Meng and Sung-hyun were talking about the gaps and how economic justice doesn't really address what we're seeing on the ground right now, especially after the pandemic. The gender-based violence piece of it really stood out to me because I think when you are, analyzing how gender-based violence and economic justice are tied together. They're both intersectional. And I know you all NAPAWF did an amazing research project, and they have findings with their clocking inequality report. And they really discuss how the barriers to economic justice limit pathways to safety and how gender-based violence, because of those limitations, can show up in the workforce as well. And so therefore, maintaining that economic independence is critical for survivors of violence as the gender wage gap increases risk of violence. When you're in a vulnerable situation of any type, especially with a wage gap being broader, there is more risk of any type of violence, including gender-based violence, to anyone. And so therefore, API GBV, we also did our own needs assessment because we work with over 160 grassroots organizations who provide services to survivors of gender-based violence from the East Coast all the way to the Pacific Islands. And almost 70% of the advocates answered and identified economic stability as the most pressing need for the AANHPI and MENA survivors. And so this is a real issue that we're seeing. And, from my time as an immigration attorney, I've helped hundreds of survivors of gender-based violence. And the one thing that I always tried to take care of immediately was their access to a work authorization, because we knew that on the ground, if survivors could work or they were able to find a job on their own, which allowed for them to bring income, then that would allow for them to leave the really dangerous situation that they were currently in. Because until they were able to work and until they were able to leave, they were subjected and, had to live with their abuser continuously. And not only were they exposing themselves, they were exposing their children. And so it really is a real issue on the ground. And, like I mentioned, 70% of the advocates identified it as the most pressing need. I also wanted to say that financial abuse is extremely common in intimate partner relationships, where 94 to 99% of survivors report this. So already it's happening in these relationships. And if you're not, able to go ahead and get your own paying job, even equal paying job, it further removes you from any type of assistance. Finally, I just wanted to say, per the Alliance for Safety and Justice, more than half of the survivors of violence report difficulty with work or school as a result of the victimization. If you are victimized, you need time for court hearings, medical appointments, childcare. And if you're not able to have that, then you're not going to seek help. And 1 in 6 survivors reported losing a job from that survey that I talked about, or being demoted when they needed time off due to victimization. And often survivors had to make a really difficult choice between choosing their safety or their jobs. And so, of course, this also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this also has a domino effect to housing and not being able to afford safe housing when you're talking about economic justice. There are other, aspects of immigration status, language barriers, the effects of model minority that I'm happy to talk about, but I just wanted to take a moment to see if you had any questions.
Thank you, Monica. I really appreciate your perspective and making those connections between gender-based violence and economic justice. Transitioning to talking, kind of going back to our original theme of talking about the wage gap. Estella, NHPI Equal Pay Day is not until August, but NHPI communities tend to be lumped into the broader NHPI data, which erases their unique economic and social realities. What are the most pressing economic justice issues facing NHPI communities today, and how can we ensure that they're not sidelined in policy and advocacy efforts?
Thank you, Sidel, for the question. I think first I'd say or offer Tercia Iowa, who is of Kiribati descent and African-American descent as well, Pacific Islander scholar. She often said, we cannot paint the Pacific with a single brush. And it's part of that is sort of like where I want to begin my response to the question. And there are more than 25,000 islands in the Pacific and so many different ethnic groups and communities that even being aggregated under the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander umbrella is a true disservice to our community. And many of our folks are even more invisible under the broader AANHPI label here in the continental US. And so it's always difficult to figure out where to start with questions that are sort of posed about the entire community, our entire diaspora here. For one, I'd say, Audre Lorde said there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. And when I think about that, plus with what Ancestor Teawa has said, it forces me to like preface everything with I am speaking always from a perspective as a Samoan growing up in the continental US who also identifies as Black Pacifican. It's difficult to name and quantify the differences or the disparities between our own community. Looking at the Equal Pay Day fact sheet report that NAPAWF put out and puts out every year, looking at that, we see that Hawaiian women are making around 62 cents per every dollar that a white man makes. Samoan women are around 64, Choimorrow 69, and Fijian at 77 cents. And that's just the disparity within Pacific Island women. And it doesn't even capture the 6 most populous communities of Pacific Islanders here in the United States. Something that was talked about in the discussion earlier with Sun Young and Congresswoman Meng about being the sandwich generation. It reminds me that many of our communities are also here in the States living in multi-generational households. And so that impacts a lot of things. And we're talking multi-generational households where, that sandwich generation is caring for elders, caring for a younger generation. But in many families are also carrying the weight of being first generation college students or college grads, which comes with additional burden, financial burden around student loans, student debt. And in addition to many of our folks being in service-oriented professions, whether it's in warehousing, travel, in education, in nursing, social work, and other related service industries or on the front lines, it causes compounding economic issues that are difficult to brush with broad strokes because each community within Pacific Islander community are dealing with a host of different issues. There are some similarities, but definitely some differences. One major issue that gets lost or continuously is a concern for our folks is around language access. Accessing applications in the workforce, accessing healthcare application, accessing veteran benefits. These things are limited, not only due to immigration issues, but also due to language access, which again costs a whole host of compounding issues or concerns. So it's really tough to answer that question. One thing I will say around supporting policy and advocacy efforts for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Island communities, something that has been effective is creating culturally responsive practices within an organization, but also in the policy advocacy efforts. Much of my career was spent in labor union organizing, and one of the ways that folks are able to get support is through their ERG groups or caucuses, caucus spaces, ethnic specific caucus spaces. So, for example, as a organizer in a teacher union, having having a specific Asian and Pacific Islander caucus space where we can elevate culturally specific issues and concerns that then make it to the larger body so that we're creating policy and mapping our organizing and advocacy efforts around culturally specific needs is super important. And so that's one way, but tons of other ways. I think also continuously those spaces and similar or parallel spaces where we're able to continuously raise awareness about our communities and the multitude of vastness and difference that is our Pacific Islands is also a really important space to continue to have, where there's constant sharing of knowledge, different ways of knowing and being, and just elevating awareness of who our people are, where we come from, and what our different relationships to this country are when we're here. Across the Pacific, each group has a very different relationship to citizenship or how to access it or access resources. And it's all based on that country's individual or respective relationship, I should say, with this nation or other quote unquote powers. So yeah, I think I might go ahead and end there and pass it back to you, Sadell.
Thank you so much. And I really like that Audre Lorde quote. And I think it also ties in nicely into our final question before we transition into some Q&A. So cross-community solidarity across ethnicities, classes, immigration statuses, and other lines of difference is essential to achieving economic justice. But building that solidarity can often be challenging. From your perspectives, what does real cross-community solidarity actually look like in the fight for economic justice? And how can we move from words and conversations like these to actually creating lasting change? And either of you can feel free to jump in first.
I'll go ahead and jump in and then pass it to Monica. I think one of I'll always go back to our land with relationships, and it's being in intentional relationships with folks from different communities, from all the communities. But it's easy to, read the text, attend the workshop or the session, but it's really about when the cameras are off or you're not on social media, who you continue to be in relationship with, who you're having really hard but generative conversation and dialogue with. And sometimes it's intentionally being in spaces with the folks that may not see an issue the same way you do, but you're able to push one another. And I will also add that does not go for, like, I'm not trying to be in a space or promote being in spaces with folks who don't see your dignity and recognize your humanity as a whole human. But I'm talking about the folks that that you can move an issue with or policy agenda alongside in real generative ways, that are caring, loving relationships.
I love that so much, Estella. And, building on that and just adding my little piece. I think, finding those intersectional partners on many issues, as the quote, and as Estella quoted, there are many, I'm paraphrasing, but we all are working on this broader issue, but there are many, intersectional points that we do need to work on with together. And so bringing the partners in the room and recognizing the expertise and acknowledging it, but also understanding that, if we all, have the same North Star, which is, having safer communities, having, access to resources, for our communities who already have it difficult and are more vulnerable, then we can get there. And I think for us, a great example is, you all, NAPAWF, bringing in API GBV to talk about gender-based violence and talking about it's not just, the pay gap, which is really important, but it's the behind the scenes of why and why it's difficult for so many of our community members, to really, access and have that leg up that is needed, especially when they're in, situations that are dangerous and violent. And so just speaking about that and connecting the dots is really important, especially now.
Thank you both so much for everything that you shared and for the important work that you both continue to lead in our communities. We're now going to transition to a brief Q&A before we close out. And as a reminder, you can drop questions either in the Q&A box, and for those of you joining on YouTube, you can drop your questions into the comments there as well. So we have a question around, is there anything that is being done to require workplaces, places of accommodation, and government to report on intersectionality data? For example, an Asian woman who is a mother or has a disability. Monica or Estella, is there anything that you would like to respond to that?
I can start off, by responding and say that no, I wish there was more that is being done to require workplaces to be more accommodating and understanding, let alone report, but just be more accommodating and understanding from the gender-based violence perspective. One policy that we've been advocating for, is the Paid Safe Leave Act, which, is an essential tool for safety, agency, and economic security from violence. Safe leave refers to paid job guaranteed leave that workers may take in order to take care of what they need to if violence has affected their home and they need to go to court, they need medical appointments, whatever they need. However, I use that as an example because that hasn't even fully passed, and what has passed are incorporating that into sick leave. And so if you're incorporating, that into sick leave, some of that data will be lost. You're not going to, report it or categorize it as assistance from violent, crimes. You're going to report it as sick leave, which really dilutes what you're trying to say. And so I use that as an example that I have not heard or seen of workplaces from my perspective when we talk about gender-based violence, taking that into account.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that as well. There is like a Mom's Equal Pay Day, which is in May. And there is also a Disabled Women's Equal Pay Day, which is in October. So we sometimes work, analyzing on the behalf of, motherhood and then disability. But it's very rare that you see those aspects layered on top of race, ethnicity, immigration status. And it's unfortunate just because the quality of the data, sometimes that analysis is just really, really hard to put together from the data that's federally available. But yeah, hopefully in the future, that information will be more accessible. And on the same note, a question specifically for Estella. Could you speak a little more about the need for data disaggregation of the NHPI umbrella? Do you know of any efforts or work being done already to do so?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Data disaggregation is needed all across the board for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, and MENA communities as well. I think for NHPI communities, it was the last census data drop that showed there is an overwhelming increase in the number of community members from who identify as Chuukese, as Yap, as Papua New Guinean. And those three groups, amongst a few others, aren't typically captured because they don't fall in the 6 most populous groups that are here in the States, which is how up until this point, ethnic racial data has been collected for communities like AANHPI communities. And what that means is a couple years from now, there will be even more limiting data available or limited data available for those communities in addition to other Pacific Islander groups that are here in the States. It impacts so much of our lives, our daily lives, how we access resources, how those resources are allocated. I can speak very intimately and specifically to what it shows up or how it looks in a public education setting. With so many years as a teacher, what became very clear is there was no way to identify or track our teachers who identify as PI or our students who identify as PI. And so several folks, community leaders and members have taken it upon themselves to capture the data themselves as best as they can, but also to reframe how we capture data in taking a step back and taking some guidance from our Native American and Indigenous folks here who are often in a similar boat. When reports come out, there's this little asterisk that says your community sample size was not large enough and therefore statistically insignificant. And so there's not a lot of data that we were able to capture or able to share. But we know that for many of our communities that also identify as Indigenous, for the Pacific as well, data or surveys are not the only way to capture data. And so revisiting how we think about data has been crucial in navigating this issue for us and also elevating or telling our own stories from our perspectives. But there are groups like the NHPI Data Policy Lab out of UCLA here in California. There is AAPI Data that also does some work around capturing additional data, and even NAPAWF's work in making sure that they've included Pacific Islander women in the studies that they've done so far has been crucial in getting as much data as possible from across different industry sectors or regions across the United States. And it was during the pandemic, it was the NHPI Data Policy Lab that really helped to demonstrate the need for disaggregated data, because what they found during the pandemic was that while it might have shown a really broad stroke that AANHPI communities were faring well, and I don't even like saying that, during that global pandemic, when the data was disaggregated, you can see that Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities were at 3 to 4 times more risk of death and had less access to COVID protections or vaccines, et cetera, during that time. And so I highlight that as one example that demonstrates the literal life and death of not having accurate and disaggregated data for our communities.
Thank you. So this question, I mean, both of you can probably speak to this, but I think it's a little bit more directed towards Monica. Have you seen any intersection or correlation between the submissive stereotype and violence against AANHPI women in the workplace?
Absolutely. And I think, Sun Hyun and Congresswoman Meng spoke about it during their talk as well, that the either the model minority myth or the, submissive stereotype does perpetuate within the workplaces and gives permission, for employers to extend more violence or really unscrupulous business practices towards women, because they know that it will be more difficult for these women to speak up based on what is being permeated about them, but also based on immigration status as well. I have worked on so many labor trafficking cases where that premise, that foundational premise, was really used as a motive of deception and, forced behavior, where, a lot of the perpetrators did not think that anyone would speak up, especially based on the references that they see in the news, in the press about the, population. And so absolutely, there is a correlation between that. We've seen it. I've seen it individually in many of the cases that I've worked on too.
Yeah, I mean, we saw it in the Atlanta spa shooting, the very tragic shooting that happened a couple years ago. Like 6 of those 8 victims were Asian women. And, part of that is to do with the fact that not only are they Asian and women, but they're also in, a low wage service profession that are not going to have, the same labor protections that other jobs would have. So one more question. Are there other opportunities for employers to become more aware of gender-based violence and address issues that may arise as a result, such as through small business development centers?
I could respond to that one as well. I think it's similar to the previous question. And so what a lot of organizations on the ground are doing, grassroots organizations, is they are working with centers, with employers to really spread the knowledge of gender-based violence and human trafficking, labor trafficking, which is something, being in Atlanta, that, we really focus on here. We sometimes lead in with talking about, labor trafficking in hotels, in, restaurants, in nail salons, massage spas. We talk about all of that, but we also make sure to address gender-based violence. It's a movement that individually a lot of these organizations on the ground are doing, but I want to say that gets exhausting, right? We need a bigger approach. We need a more collective approach in order to do the education rather than these one-off education opportunities. We need to have policies and we need to really talk about it. I think the Atlanta spa shootings, as Sidel mentioned, brought up a lot of these issues, to the general public, and the continuation every year here in Atlanta, we bring it up and we talk about it and we make sure we address it. But that's just here and it needs to continue. We really need to do the outreach and do the education and can't stop for our communities.
Thank you so much, Monica. I think those are all the questions that we've had. So to wrap up, what we've heard today underscores what so many of us already know, that the fight for economic justice for AANHPI women and gender expansive people is not just about closing wage gaps. It's about dismantling systems that were never built to serve us in the first place. It's about whether our aunties, our moms, our neighbors can make ends meet. It's about whether our communities are safe, resourced, and valued. And most of all, it's about whether our labor, paid or unpaid, is seen as worthy. And so as we move forward from today, let us carry with us the stories, the strategies, and the solidarity shared here. Let this be a reminder that we are not alone in this work and that together we are building a future rooted in justice, care, and collective power. To stay up to date on future events like this one, as well as other issues impacting AANHPI women, girls, and gender expansive individuals, you can sign up for our email list by visiting napawf.org. Thank you again, Monica and Estella, and to all of our speakers, our partners, and everyone that tuned in today. Let's keep pushing forward.